Of the various planes in the multiverse of Magic the Gathering, few are as instantly recognizable as Innistrad. This plane is themed heavily around 18th century Germany with influences from various cultures and regions of Europe. What makes it more distinct compared to the other eurocentric planes like the Prague-inspired Ravnica is the heavy theming of Innistrad. Beyond being a German plane, Innistrad is the Gothic Horror plane, with many creatures and cards serving as direct homages to classics of the genre. The popularity of Innistrad's horror theming has made it a frequent setting for main storylines with iconic characters, staving off a new apocalypse almost every visit. Players were first properly introduced to the setting of Innistrad in the set of the same name, released in 2011. Innistrad was a top-down design set, meaning that the flavor and themes of the set came first and the mechanics of the set were built around that. This led to experimentation such as the introduction of dual-face cards, which had a secondary card on the back. Initially used to highlight the monstrous transformations common on the plane, these dual-face cards eventually would become a staple of Magic set design, and a common feature in sets completely unrelated to the themes of Innistrad. Innistrad, as a set, is remembered as one of the best of its time. It remains a template for a top-down set to this day. However, our main focus is more on the lore and narrative of the plane. With several draftable standard sets that takes place entirely on Innistrad, this plane is perhaps one of the most fleshed out in terms of history and key figures spanning the multiverse's history. Given the depth of material to cover, the only place where it makes sense to start is at the beginning of the known Innistradi history roughly 7,000 years ago. In these early days before the Great Mending restructured the multiverse, Innistrad was a dark and desolate plane already struggling for survival. The humans of the plane often resorted to witchcraft and harvest rituals just to survive the harsh landscape and the monsters that roamed it. After a particularly rough bout of famine, an alchemist made a deal with a demon named Shelgengar to experiment with the blood of one of the plane's native angels. The alchemist not only wished to find an answer to the famine slowly killing his people, but also selfishly wished to prolong his own life by any means necessary. This blood alchemy eventually gave way to a procedure by which the subject will gain their sustenance from drinking the blood of other living beings. This alchemist was named Edgar Markov, and he was the first vampire of Innistrad. The Birth of Vampirism on the plane did in fact save the plane from famine. While only a select few could be vampires, these vampires could sustain themselves without touching the plane's limited crop supply, and the needs of these vampires would lead to the natural predation of humans, and by extension limit the human population to more manageable numbers. By introducing a natural predator that actively feeds on humans, Innistrad became, at least on some levels, a more sustainable plane for human life, assuming that the vampires did not overfeed. In these early days, a form of mutual respect existed between humans and vampires, as if there were a form of symbiosis driving these two species forward. This was primarily thanks to the leadership of House Markov and its pursuit of balance for the plane. Beyond Edgar, the most notable Markov is undoubtedly his grandson, Sorin Markov. When he was turned into a vampire, the shock of the transformation ignited his Planewalker spark. For those unaware, a Planeswalker is a powerful type of mage with an inherited ability to traverse from one world to another plane of existence. Sorin Markov is one of the oldest living planeswalkers in lore, having existed for thousands of years thanks to his vampirism. While Sorin did travel the multiverse, he never abandoned the plane of his birth like some planeswalkers do. Sorin views Innistrad as his home and takes maintaining its balance very seriously. Early on in Sorin's afterlife, particularly 1,000 years after being turned into a vampire, he came into contact with the beings known as the Eldrazi. These eldritch beings appeared on a plane and would warp anything in their path, be it the land before them or the minds and bodies of those who opposed them. During Sorin's travels in the multiverse, he eventually came into contact with Ugin the Spear Dragon, a planeswalker from the plane Tarkir. These two worked alongside a third planeswalker, Nahiri the Lithomancer, to seal away the Eldrazi on Nahiri's home plane of Zendikar. It took a great deal of effort and countless years of works for the three ageless planeswalkers to eventually construct the aligned Hadron network and seal away the Eldrazi. Nahiri in particular was hesitant to use her home plane as the Eldrazi's prison, worried as to what might happen to her home and the people if the Eldrazi ever managed to escape. As such, the three planeswalkers made a pact so that if the Eldrazi ever did escape, all three would come to Zendikar's aid and stave off the Eldrazi threat. With that, all three went their separate ways, each returning to tending to their respective homes. Nahir saw to the maintenance of the Hadron network on Zendikar. Ugin returned to his Dragon Tempest on Tarkir, and Sorin returned to Innistrad to come up with some answers to the growing rift between humans and vampires. In the centuries since vampires were introduced to the plane, the connection between the two related species began to fracture. Many vampires saw themselves as inherently superior to the humans that they once were, and saw no reason to hold back in their hunting. Sorin's perspective as a planeswalker gave him a sense of clarity to the situation that the other vampires lacked. He'd watched as the plane's social hierarchy shifted over the ages, each visit to a new plane taking him somewhere else where humans had more of a fighting chance and weren't a prey species on their own plane. The other vampires had no interest in Sorin's pleas, however, insisting that the eternal life of vampires meant they had eternity to figure out a solution that benefits everyone, and there was no need to be so harsh in the immediate. Eventually, Sorin decided that he had to take matters into his own hands, with not even his grandfather Edgar receptive to any of the human-protecting ideas Sorin brought to the table. Sorin used his immense power as a planeswalker in conjunction with the power of the plane's silver moon to create a protector for the humans of the plane. This protector came in the form of Archangel Avacyn. While there have been angels on Innistrad since its earliest days, these flights of angels were fractured into separate groups and relatively reclusive. Avacyn was an immensely powerful being who existed to protect the humans of the plane and keep the balance. While the native angels of the plane could tell that Avacyn was unnatural and not quite like her sisters, her strength and noble aspirations made her a natural leader for the angels regardless. The leaders of the different flights of angels accepted Avacyn as their sister and joined together under her leadership. Each flight of angels was still led by their own respective angel, but followed the commands of Avacyn. These flights each represented a different color of mana and astrological phase. Sigarda, host of Herons, presided over the green-aligned angels and protected humans from harm and life and represented the new moon. Bruna, a light of alabaster, ordained over the blue-aligned angels and protected holy sites and prevented the desecration of the dead and was represented by the hunter's moon. Gazella, Blade of Goldnight, led the combatant red-aligned angels that were represented by the sun, who oversaw the training of human warriors known as Cathars, as well as most active combat against the monsters of the plane. There was a fourth sister, the eldest and most powerful of these original angels, Lisa, Shroud of Dusk. Aligned with black mana, her flight of angels sought to stave off the threat of monsters by better understanding them. They'd actively work with witches and vampires, learning how to both coexist and how to better dispatch of them after gaining trust. While this had already been controversial, Lisa's eventual deal with demon lords was too much for Avacyn's strict views to abide with. Avacyn personally slaughtered Lisa and her entire flight of Dusk, purging this fourth sister from the history of the plane entirely, as if she had never existed beyond vague rumblings. Once the remaining flights of angels were in line, the angels took to their new roles as protectors, guarding the humans of the plane, protecting them from the creatures of the night. Given Avacyn's power, her fondness to humans, and her connection to the magical moon that had long since captured the attention of the humans of the plane, it was perhaps no surprise that this artificial angel eventually would become a proper religious figure. The Church of Avacyn rose to prominence in the wake of her taking up the role of humanity's guardian. Her power was so great that humans who showed faith and devotion in her would gain power, as if blessed by Avacyn herself. She helped reinstill faith in the proper peaceful afterlife, something which was not a guarantee in Innistrad. The plane already had a spirit problem with the plane's geist serving as pests at best and worst reminders of how easily one becomes trapped on this mortal coil. Even if your spirit does not linger with unfinished business, there's a chance a necromancer would revive you for some ill deeds. Avacyn not only protected the living humans from werewolves and vampires, but also ensured the dead would pass on properly and not be left as lingering souls. Sorin aimed to make a self-balancing system where the creatures of the night would exist but not overstep their bounds thanks to Avacyn's interference. She would smite any living threats and purify any undead, leaving the hordes of monsters unable to truly overrun humanity. And whenever Avacyn faced a foe too strong to actually defeat, she could instead turn to the second half of Sorin's plans for the planar piece, the Helvault. This vault was made from the moon silver of the plane, one of the strongest substances in the multiverse given its magical properties. This silver structure served as a holy monument to the humans of the plane, but in practice was actually a prison for demons or other dissidents that were beyond Avacyn's capabilities to smite. Those more tricky foes would simply be sealed away in the Helvault for the rest of time, unable to do anything to escape. This system of using Avacyn in the Helvault to keep the plane in check was effective. However, it came at the cost of most other vampires, especially the more bloodthirsty Voldaren clan, viewing Sorin as a coward and a traitor to his kind. Sometime during the rise of the Church of Avacyn, the Eldrazi nearly broke their containment on Zendikar. Nahiri did as she was told and sent a message across the multiverse to her two associates. Ugin at this point had already been murdered by his brother Nico Bolas and thus was not available, despite neither other party being aware of this. Sorin for his part never received the message, perhaps thanks to the interference caused by the Helvault. When Nahiri eventually calmed the problem herself temporarily and went to confront Sorin over his abandonment, he showed little actual care for the promise he'd broken. He showed no sympathy for missing the call and didn't even feign interest in continued help with the Eldrazi problem. This angered Nahiri, who threatened Sorin, which in turn alerted Avacyn to a potential threat to the plane. The two fought for some time before eventually Sorin called off the fighting and threw Nahiri into the Helvault while she was distracted. Despite being a powerful lethomancer, Nahiri could not manipulate the silver of the Helvault and was thus trapped, unaware of anything but the darkness and the demons that surrounded her. She also had no way of checking in on Zendikar, which with a loosened seal was in more threat than ever. She assumed with each passing year in the Helvault that her plane was more and more likely to have been razed entirely, and all the core planeswalker could do is smolder in silent rage over the betrayal, while Sorin continued on with his balancing act on the plane of Innistrad. From there, life continued on Innistrad with relative normalcy. Over the centuries, technology did advance to some degree, with new forms of science coming to rival the magic of old. The traditional ways of the plane gave way to more modern innovations. The security of the Church of Avacyn led to less and less witchcraft and folk magic, as it was seen as heretical. Even beyond belief, the plane's social structure shifted heavily as we approach the contemporary era. There are multiple great houses of vampires scattered across the plane with higher numbers than ever before. The Church of Avacyn and its Cathars have done well to stave off threats from both the Bloodsuckers and the various necromancers and the other ne'er-do-wells of the plane. There's no greater example than the rift in the plane's culture than looking at the necromancy practices that formed the rise of the Stitchers. Advancements in harnessing electricity and surgical procedures allowed for the rise of Frankenstein-style zombies, as opposed to the more traditional reanimated corpses. Now, in modern Innistrad, the most notable of these Stitchers is Stitcher Geralf, a proud man of science and the pupil of the genius necro-alchemist Ludovic. Geralf Sakani, however, has a rival in the form of his sister, Ghoul-Caller Gisa, a staunchly traditional necromancer who believes that Stitchers have lost the true art of raising the dead. These two, while not present in the first Innistrad set, have been a part of its lore via flavor text since the initial set, with their bickering showing both how this plane has shifted over time, and also how generally mad even its humans residents can be. But for now, the Psyche siblings take more of a backseat as we reach the point of the narrative where the first Innistrad set began. Avacyn, the plane's protector, had vanished and there was nothing to protect the humans from things that went bump in the night. Without Avacyn to instill these values and protect humans, demon worship grew in popularity, with the once ancient and obscure Skirdax cult gaining proper prominence as members secretly infiltrated high society. This disappearance was caused by the demon lord Griselbrand, one of the most powerful demons to ever live on the plane. He challenged Avacyn to a duel, and while the two were evenly matched, one could not properly take out the other. Avacyn saw no other choice than to use the Helvault, but Griselbrand was prepared for this. In his last moments before being sealed, he impaled Avacyn and drug her into the Helvault with him, trapping away both in stone. The only witnesses to this were Mikaeus the Lunarch, leader of the Church of Avacyn, and his most trusted Cathars. With no clue what to do, the church was powerless as the creatures of the night encroached upon the people of Innistrad once more. Salvation came from an unlikely source thanks to the efforts of the planeswalker Lillian Vess. She had no personal interest in Avacyn's safety. Instead, she found herself on Innistrad because she needed Griselbrand dead. Ages prior, she'd brokered a deal with demons on different planes to add up to eternal youth and great power. She appreciated her youth and power, but didn't exactly enjoy letting others use her soul, so she simply decided she'd kill her debtors before they could properly collect. She searched far and wide for Griselbrand, all the while avoiding the planeswalker Gorok Wildspeaker, who had been hunting her across the multiverse ever since she cursed him with the Chain of Veil. Lillian finally got a lead when she found Mikaeus' forces doing battle with one of Geralf Cician Zombie's armies. Mikaeus was killed in the struggle, which only made things easier for the necromancer Lillian Vess. She reanimated him on the spot and used him to glean what had happened to Griselbrand. While Lillian herself could not destroy the Helvault, she knew perfectly well what sort of leverage she'd need. She turned to Thalia, Guardian Thrabin, one of the highest ranking Cathars in the church, and one of the few people capable of destroying the Moonsilver Vault. Lillian offered a simple ultimatum of destroying the Helvault or watch as Lillian slaughtered all of the Thalian men. In the end, Thalia destroyed the Helvault and unleashed everything that had been sealed inside. From there, Lillian tracked down Griselbrand after his escape and killed him, eventually adopting Innistrad as a new home plane and base of operations for the time being. Avacyn, for her part, got right back to work protecting the plane, leading to a short period of a few years in which Innistrad was as close to true peace as it had ever been. This time frame would go on to be known as Kirsmu. During this period, Avacyn in particular worked with those afflicted with lycanthropy. One of the monsters of Innistrad, werewolves were perhaps some of the trickiest to deal with. Vampires were openly bloodthirsty predators, Geists were spirits lashing out at the unfairness of their death, the undead were shambling puppets for their masters. Most threats were as obvious as they were unflinching in their evil. Werewolves, conversely, were born from humans, often still looked and acted like humans, and yet still would savagely kill humans under the light of the moon. Avacyn found that the curse of lycanthropy muddled the human soul with a wild animalistic spirit. She could not remove the wild side without destroying the innate humanity. So instead, she sought to unify and soothe these conflicting sides, creating the Wolfer. While the Wolfer make up a minority amongst the wolf folk of the plane, they remained an example of how Avacyn truly aimed to help humanity, even those who were no longer fully human themselves. Despite the shattering of the Helvault, things seemed better than ever for the plane. Avacyn had even begun working at healing the greater werewolf population to remove one of the existential threats looming over the plane. Unfortunately, for every single person who called Innistrad home, the destruction of the Helvault freed Nahiri alongside all the angels and demons, and the plane would soon find out that Nahiri was far more dangerous than any simple demon. The moment she was free from the Helvault, she planeswalked straight to Zendikar, only to find the Eldrazi were already running rampant and tearing her plane apart. Unaware that a new coalition of planeswalkers had formed to counteract this Eldrazi threat, and drained from her centuries of captivity, Nahiri felt as if Zendikar was doomed, an already dead world waiting for the end. As such, Nahiri's heart settled onto revenge. If Zendikar was doomed by the Eldrazi, Innistrad would be next. Nahiri returned to Innistrad and formed a friendship with Gisa Sasani. The Lethalmancer began her revenge by laying waste to Markov Manor, killing or imprisoning most every vampire in Sorin's family. From there, she set about creating her cryptoliths, stone monuments that distorted the flow of mana through the plane's ley lines and served as a beacon to summon the Eldrazi. Gisa's army of ghouls assisted with placing the structures as well as the building's focal point of the summoning ritual, the Downyard Temple. While this new planeswalker coalition, the Gatewatch, had managed to kill 2 of the Eldrazi Titans on Zendikar during this time, the third and strongest remained. While the other Eldrazi Titans manipulated space and mass itself, the final Titan, Emrakul, warped the mind and very being of those that came into contact with it. Beyond the sheer destructive power an Eldrazi invasion promised, the very presence of the cryptoliths and their mana distortion powers was enough to drive its denizens into outright madness. No being on the plane was more overtly affected by the cryptoliths' madness than Avacyn herself. Angels are beings of pure mana, constructed more than born. As such, the cryptoliths and the early traces of Emrakul greatly hastened the mental strain on the angels and particularly cracked the once altruistic Avacyn. She began to feel disgusted towards the humans she once protected, eventually finding them to be the true blight on Innistrad. She aroused all of the angels she could into a slaughterous frenzy, becoming Avacyn the Purifier and seeking to kill any and all humans she could that stood in the way of the true purity. This rocked the Church of Avacyn, with Skurzdak cultists who had infiltrated the Order using this instability to oust high-ranking members like Thalia for opposing the head of the Church. Of the angelic flights, only the flights of Herons led by Sigarda remained at humanity's side. The Alabaster of the Gold Knight flights both fell in line with Avacyn, merging and rebranding as the collective Moonsilver Flight in the Purge of the Plane. The former leaders of those flights, Bruna and Gisela, also merged and rebranded into Brisela, Voice of Nightmares, an angelic abomination completely warped beyond recognition. Nahiri had succeeded in pushing Innistrad to the absolute brink without even fully summoning the Titan yet. Even just corrupting Avacyn would have done horrible damage to the balance of the plane. Monsters ran amok, and the Skurzdak rallied behind their demonic ruler, Orbendal, Profane Prince, after he was freed from the Helvault. But this was no mere shakeup to the power balance. The influence of Emrakul warped the bodies and minds of nearly every living being on the plane. Emrakul, the promised end, was a living apocalypse, converting more and more of the world to its side with each passing day. Despite Nahiri's apocalyptic intentions, however, there was at least a glimmer of hope. The planeswalker Jace Beleren had been sent to the plane of Innistrad to investigate why Sorin had not come to aid against the Eldrazi on Innistrad, and if he'd heard of Nahiri. Thanks to time travel interference on Takir, an event we've discussed in a previous video, Ugin was no longer dead and capable of assisting on Zendikar with the Eldrazi threat. He was concerned by the other two failing to aid the plane, especially Nahiri had always been so passionate about her home. When Jace arrived on Innistrad, the plane was already in the earliest stages of corruption. He was joined in his investigation by Tamiyo, the Moon Sage, a Kamigawan researcher who had taken up residence on Innistrad to study its moon. The two eventually traced the source of this madness back to Avacyn herself, who attacked the two planeswalkers. It was only thanks to Sorin intervening that either of the two survived. Avacyn temporarily regained her sanity when faced with her creator. In her moment of lucidity, she blamed Sorin for creating her with an exploitable flaw that corrupted her so easily. She had become humanity's greatest threat, which disgusted her to her very core. She denounced Sorin and called down her flight of angels to attack. Sorin dispatched them all with relative ease and finally turned his focus back to the Archangel. Avacyn vowed that she would never abide by a monster such as Sorin and would fight him until the end of time, since she could only be bound and not killed. Sorin replied by showing that while she could not be killed, as her creator, he could certainly unmake her. Sorin destroyed the closest thing he had to a daughter, and in the process undid the last of her magic that protected the plane. While the threat of Avacyn had been defeated, it was hardly the victory one might have hoped for. Sorin suddenly realized that Avacyn's unmaking had been the final piece of Nahiri's plan all along. With the final layer of defensive magic over the plane gone, Nahiri was able to finally summon Emrakul from the Blind Eternities and onto the plane proper. Up until this point, all of the warping had come from external influences seeping in and the influence of the cryptoliths. Now that the Titan had been fully unleashed, serving as a living, flying apocalypse, Emrakul, the Promised End, towered over the plane. Its influence so vast the entire townships warped and combined into a giant flesh of monstrosities. Sorin himself viewed the plane to be lost, resolving himself to a bitter blood feud with Nahiri in the dying days of his homeworld. Nahiri, for her part, also assumed Innistrad was done for, fighting Sorin and imprisoning him in a stone wall before fleeing the plane herself to leave it to die. Jace and Tamiyo knew this was a threat far beyond their capabilities, and summoned the rest of the Gatewatch. The main forces of the Gatewatch assisted with the battling in the major township of Thraben, as Jace and Tamiyo worked in finding ways to seal or imprison Emrakul. The mind-warping capabilities of Emrakul were so vast that it took Jace's immense skill as a mind mage to keep his allies from going completely insane. And even then, Emrakul's influence whispered at the corners of his mind. Any living being was at risk of falling to Emrakul's influence, which made any prolonged conflict with it nearly impossible for a living army. Fortunately, the Gatewatch managed to convince Lillian Vest to contribute her strengths. Despite her generally self-serving attitude, it was Lillian Vest's undead army which helped minimize the lives lost during this apocalyptic event. This bought Tamiyo enough time to perform the sealing ritual to trap Emrakul in the plane's silver moon, essentially using it as a giant Helvault. Once Emrakul was imprisoned in the moon, all seemed to be going well, or at least as well as the dreary plane of Innistrad can be. However, Jace was met with a vision from Emrakul, in which the Eldrazi made it clear it was its intent to be placed in the moon, and that its prison was anything but. Unable to do anything constructive with this, Jace kept the threat to himself as the Gatewatch carried on with their duties in the multiverse. Life on Innistrad continued to be a hardship, yet far more manageable than the period of Eldrazi influence which came to be known as the Travails. Uneasy peace stood for 2 years or so, although the lack of Avacyn and the subtle influence of Emrakul could be felt all over the plane. Sigarda and the remaining Sane Angels remained to protect humans as best they could in the stead of the former Archangel. But beyond the threat of monsters, Emrakul's stay in the moon had slowly offset the balance of night and day on the plane. Nights grew longer and longer, threatening to overtake the day entirely, and plunge the plane into an eternal dark where the monsters would truly reign supreme. Without Avacyn's guidance or magic, the plane leaned on the old ways to find strength and salvation. Witchcraft and folk magic returned to prominence now that Avacyn would no longer be there to persecute it as heresy. The Dawnheart Coven aimed to restore the balance of the day and night and protect Innistrad's humanity during the Harvest Festival using an ancient artifact known as the Celestus. The Gatewatcher member Teferia Kosa was present on the plane seeking a means to stave off the looming threat of Phyrexia. At this time in the magic narrative, a species of xenophobic half-metal, half-flesh abominations were in the early stages of planning their multiversal takeover. While Teferi's primary focus had been on stopping the Phyrexians, he offered his aid to Arlen Cord and those organizing the Harvest Festival. Not all wished for the humans to succeed, and the more violent and anti-human werewolf packs opted to storm the festival. During the chaos that ensued, the key to the artifact was stolen by none other than Olivia Voldaren, leader of the Voldaren bloodline of vampires. Embittered by Sorin's passive nature and fondness for humans, Olivia aimed to solidify not only her control over vampires, but vampiric control over all of Innistrad. Olivia's midnight ambush pushed the plane even further into chaos, as there seemed to be no reprieve from the encroaching night. To make matters worse, Olivia had also seemed to be witching Edgar Markov into marrying her, so that she would unify House Markov and House Voldaren and take overt control over all of vampire kind. It was thanks to the spirit of Cathilda Dawnheart Martyr, who had been separated from her body in the botched ritual, that the forces of good were able to crash the wedding and reclaim the Moonsilver Key. From there, the Dawnheart Coven were able to finish the ritual and restore balance to the plane. At least, they restored balance for all of a few months' time. Despite the efforts of the Gatewatch, Phyrexia managed to launch their invasion of the multiverse. Almost every known plane in the multiverse experienced some level of Phyrexian threat. Innistrad was no exception, with it seeing heavy conflict with Phyrexian forces throughout its most populated areas. However, Innistrad was no stranger to apocalypses at this point in history. In fact, Gisa Sasani used remnants from those killed in the Travails as the basis of her zombie army that helped stave off most of the fighting in the region of Innistrad known as Havengul. Gisa only aided so directly in the efforts against the Phyrexians to compete against her brother Geralf in his stitching. Since Phyrexian conversion affects the mind primarily, undead were generally immune to phyresis. This made zombie hordes a rather effective means to wage war with the Phyrexians. Thalia, for her part, aided in protecting the living, finding a surprising mount in the form of the Gitrog monster. This giant frog serves as the centerpiece of a small yet dedicated cult that worship and feed the monster. However, Thalia managed to tame it enough, or at least entice it enough to lend its strength in staving off Phyrexia. While no plane made it through the invasion unscathed, it's safe to say that Innistrad was, if nothing else, more equipped for a world-ending threat than the average plane. And this brings us to Innistrad as it exists now in the story. While it played a minor role in the invasion plotline overall, Innistrad's popularity and wealth of iconic characters makes it almost certainly a place we shall return to. This video didn't even go into some of the better known side characters such as the Geist of St. Traft and the powers he beholds upon Thalia, or the fan favorite girlfriends Hal and Alina. Today, we mainly aim to provide an overview of the history of the plane and the overarching story we've seen in the mainline sets. If there's a character or storyline from Innistrad you'd like to hear more about, such as Magic's weakest planeswalkers Tibalt or Adar Velkane, the planeswalkers who tricked demons into shady contracts to work for him, those would be topics for another time. Innistrad has appeared in supplemental products so frequently and returns so often in stories that it's only a matter of time before the story dictates another visit anyways. It's proven to be such a popular setting that the game has expanded into a second horror plane with the introduction of the upcoming Duskmourn set. While Innistrad is no longer the only horror plane in the multiverse, its iconic style and deeply ingrained lore make it unlikely it loses its place in the spotlight anytime soon. And that's the video. Was there any part of Innistrad's lore you'd like to see expanded upon in a follow-up, or do you have any unrelated ideas you feel would be good fit for the Unknown Side of series? Feel free to comment them down below if so.